History tells us that the armies of Rome brought law, order, and peace to the empire. But Roman citizens had less peace and security when it came to their gods. In an effort to find success in life, they worshipped many gods, including the ruling Caesar. Then, into the empire came a letter written by the Apostle Paul. Paul's letter to the Romans came like a sword of truth to the heart of the empire. Romans, the letter that changed the world by a challenge to the gods of Rome on this day of discovery. This is the land of the Bible, modern Jordan. This region of Jordan marked the eastern frontier of the Roman Empire, and here remains the most well-preserved Roman city in the world, the city of Jerash. Jerash, one of the 10 Middle Eastern cities that the Romans knew as the Decapolis. Jerash was just one of hundreds of imperial cities modeled after the city of Rome, which was some 1,500 miles away. These strategic Roman cities are a major reason that the empire could maintain control of its many occupied nations. Day of Discovery's Mark D. Hahn and Jimmy DeYoung have entered the gates of Jerash to enter the world of the Roman Empire. They've come to explore Rome's ancient laws and beliefs and to reflect on the contents of a letter from the Apostle Paul that posed a spiritual challenge to one of the greatest empires in history.
Have you ever tried to imagine yourself living in another time and place? Let's see if we can find ourselves today in a day when the Caesars of Rome ruled the world and held the power of life and death in their hands.
Well, speaking of life and death, we're very close to the Hippodrome. We ought to go in here at Jerash and see how they will reenact what took place in the Roman Empire, the Circus Maximus. Great Circus Maximus, a center for entertainment in the Roman Empire. Uh-oh, Martin, looks like, to me, one of the gladiators. You gonna take him on, or will I take him on?
No, but we were talking about Rome holding in his hand the power of life and death.
I notice the sign here says, not only will we see the gladiators, but the legionnaires of the Roman chariot races. They're about to begin any moment now. Why don't we go on inside and see if we can experience how it was 2,000 years ago in the Roman Empire.
Hey Jim, this doesn't feel right. Did you pay that parking ticket?
I did. I don't think we should be here right now.
Jimmy and I were expecting a reenactment, but we had no idea we were going to be so close to the action. This Roman legion, made up of local Jordanian men, demonstrated marches, formations, and charges that the Romans used to create shock and awe in their enemies. Next came the gladiators. Though the fights were rehearsed, we still felt the threat of their ancient weapons. When one gladiator took control of the other, he'd turn to the crowd and ask for the sign of life or death. Thumbs up for life, and thumb not down but to the side meant death. That thumb turned to the side pictured a knife to the throat. The final event was the chariot races here in the Hippodrome. The Hippodrome, a word that means a horse racetrack, was a sports arena, a theater, and a showcase for Roman power. It was the ancient high-definition television, only in real life. Military might, in conjunction with firm laws, ensured that Roman authority was respected throughout the region.
The Roman law code, of course, which has had such a tremendous subsequent influence, on the world's law codes. As a matter of fact, most of the world's law codes are based either or partially on English common law and Roman law. Therefore, although all aspects of Roman law we wouldn't find too congenial today, it was very permissive, of course, at the time of the late Republic and the Empire in terms of gladiatorial combat. Yes, it was okay to kill somebody if it's in entertainment, if it's a public game of some kind. This is a brutal aspect of Romanitas, Roman culture, that we find so hard to believe today.
And when you're watching the blood sport of gladiators, it's easy to forget that Roman society was also known by a long list of virtues that were reinforced by a strong government, as well as by a culture that rewarded those who complied with the Roman way.
The Romans were famous for what we might call their emphasis on the Stoic virtues. They prided themselves on being people of discipline. They prided themselves on being people who would establish the rule of law, who would help people to find their rightful place in society and live as good citizens in relationship to one another.
Rome was built on strong virtues: law, faithfulness to the law and the authorities, hard workers, practical view of life, and many agree to say that these virtues gave the strength to Rome and spread out all over the Mediterranean area.
Its armies had conquered most of Western Europe, up to the Euphrates River in the east. They will finally go on and even conquer Mesopotamia. So here we have an empire that extended generally from Britain in the northwest to Babylon in the southeast.
Citizens of the Roman Empire believed that the gods themselves had arranged for them to conquer and civilize the world.
And certainly this fact of feeling a sense of mission, that the gods had put them on the earth to conquer and civilize. And in their own words, for example, Livy tried to stress this fact that they succeeded because they were virtuous. And what he meant by virtuous was this capacity that the Romans had of putting the public good before their own, this fact of recognizing authority, of having respect for authority, of recognizing the absolute value of discipline, of worshiping the gods in the correct manner, and knowing how to suffer and resist.
Among these Roman virtues was tenacity, strength of mind, the ability to stick to one's purpose, industriousness, hard work, dutifulness, a respect for the natural order socially, politically, and religiously, includes the ideas of patriotism and devotion to others. Through the reenactment, Jimmy and I could see that by discipline and hard work, Roman soldiers and citizens could know that they were in good standing with their Caesar. But spiritually, Romans really had no idea if they were measuring up to the requirements of their gods. Though Rome had brought peace to the empire, her people had no source of personal peace in this life, nor hope for the life to come. They had no way of knowing whether their lives would be given a thumbs up or a thumb of death. This was due in part to the fact that the Romans were confused by their polytheism. They really didn't know what to believe.
The Romans hedged their bets, that they didn't really believe necessarily that there was a guy called Apollo who drives the sun through the sky every day on a chariot. They were extremely cynical about the ancient myths. This is something which had already taken place in Greece long before Rome came to prominence. Plato says this, and so they believed that the blessed gods, in their blessedness, were fundamentally indifferent to the individual. But these are accepted traditions and customs that we worship the gods in a certain way, we offer certain sacrifices, we adhere to certain customs, and so we just keep doing this without really believing. So there were a lot of mystery cults in the ancient world, which were, we don't know very much about them because none of them has a sacred book that is a definitive reference point the way the Bible is a definitive reference point for Jews and Christians. But they do create a sense that on some level the divinity is really interested in you. So the Romans kept their options open, as it were. And it would not be at all an unusual thing for an ordinary Roman to participate in the public worship of the emperor as a god, and then go home and offer sacrifices to his cloud of dead ancestors, and then, later on in the week, go and participate in the rites of Mithras or Isis or some other mystery cult.
That's something to write home about.
You mean email?
Email? You realize where we are?
That's what you
Come
always
on,
use.
Jim. Come on. Remember where we are.
In
We're going to write this
Roman
out
city.
longhand on this, okay? You got something to do tonight.
Looks like a first century scroll of some type.
And one of the reasons we've come here is because the Apostle Paul, writer of the New Testament, wrote a letter on a scroll, probably something like this. Today we look back and say it's probably one of the most important letters ever written. It's something we want to talk about today.
Actually, the Roman Empire did have a postal system. It would use horses and couriers to carry documents like this from city to city. The Apostle Paul probably did not use their postal system, but would have instead had one of his associates or a personal friend carry this letter from city to city, from church to church. This particular scroll is a replica, made very similar to the ones that would have been available in the first century. It would have a leather cover and then the parchment inside.
Paul's letter, quietly carried into the capital of Rome, was addressed to the citizens of this great city, to house churches made up of both Jewish and Gentile followers of Christ.
When we read the letters of Paul to Romans and his greetings to the Church of Rome, we easily realize that his greetings were addressed to several churches. So this gives us the fact that here in Rome were different gatherings of churches, mixed community even of Jews and Gentiles worshiping together the only one God, the only one Creator and Savior. And these gatherings were in homes, the home churches.
When the significance of Paul's message was understood, it would challenge everything the Roman world believed about how people relate to one another and to the one true God.
As long as Roman citizens and visitors like Martin and myself would stay in the middle of the road and keep the Roman law, we'd really have nothing to fear from the laws of Rome.
At least social compliance would mean that there would be nothing to fear from the Caesars. But there was another Lord and God whose followers were quickly multiplying within the empire. And this Lord had a reputation for not settling for mere outward compliance.
We know about that Lord from a letter, a first century letter, that was written by the Apostle Paul. He addressed it to the Romans who were located there in Rome itself.
And what's so important about the letter that Paul wrote to the Romans is that he used it to express that the Lord of creation that he worshiped not only made an issue of people's heart compliance to himself, but more importantly that he had offered a solution, an amazing solution that none of us living here in the Roman Empire could have imagined. But the solution Paul offered for our human plight before God posed a potential problem for his Jewish readers. For them, it was not these Roman laws that were most important. It was their moral laws, laws of Moses like the 10 Commandments that were literally written in stone.
One of the things that Paul does in Romans is to try to help Jews particularly understand that their law, the Torah, which they put so much stock in, was not God's final word to his people. This would have been quite scandalous, particularly to the Jews who were hearing this. How could Paul say this about our law, about the law that God gave his people, Israel? And Paul will ultimately explain that he doesn't have anything against the law per se, but what he wants to show is that the law can't answer the human problem. The law comes to people who are already sinful, already held prisoners by sin, and they can't do the law. So in a sense, it's like saying to a man drowning out in the lake, oh, just swim to shore. Well, nice advice and appropriate advice, but it's impossible to do. And so God's law cannot be fulfilled by human beings under sin. It's a dead end when it comes to really taking care of the human problem and establishing a relationship with God.
No one will be declared righteous in God's sight by observing the law. Rather, through the law, we become conscious of sin. Romans chapter 3.
Hey, follow me. I want to show you something. Hey, Jim, what you doing? What are you doing?
Well, I'm trimming my beard. What does it look like I'm doing?
It looks like you found a relic to me. What are you doing with this thing? That's ridiculous.
Now, wait a minute.
Is that
My
Roman?
daughter gave me that many years ago.
It looks like a Roman relic to me.
I've used it for these many years.
What do you can't even see yourself in that.
And it does not make you any more handsome, does it?
Or good either, Jim. Look at that. I can't believe it. That's ridiculous. Interestingly, as a mirror reflects our physical flaws, laws like the Ten Commandments show us our spiritual imperfections, our inability to measure up to God's standards.
I would not have known what sin was except through the law. Romans chapter 7.
So although God's law is a good and holy thing, it tells us who He is, it gives us good advice, it's not the answer to the problem. So Paul's attack on the Jewish law, I think implicitly we have to see becomes an attack on all law, on whatever system people are trying to establish as a way of finding approval with God and making themselves feel good. The Romans had a great emphasis on law. They were famous for their laws and the way they tried to rule the empire with authority and justice and so forth. And so when Paul is attacking the Jewish law, by implication, he is clearly attacking that Roman law as well and saying, that's a dead end. The Roman law might be a very helpful thing, but it's not the answer. You'd better not put your eggs in that basket because it's not going to be something that ultimately will satisfy.
This location along the Cardo would be what we would understand as a soldiers' club, a Roman soldiers' club.
Hey, Jim, come on up here. I got the solution. You're a Roman soldier, right? And this is a fountain. Imagine it filled with water. Look down, Jim. What do you see?
The reflection.
A reflection big enough for you, Jim.
I can't carry this with me, though, like my little mirror.
Right. You know, we've been joking about seeing ourselves in a reflection. The Apostle Paul, in his letter to the Romans, wasn't joking, though, when he talked about our struggle to look good and to be good. In fact, when you read what Paul wrote to the Romans, you get the sense that the law itself, whether it be Jewish law or Roman law, would be like a mirror, a reflection. You could look into it and see what you were like, but it wouldn't change you.
That is true. Whether it be the Roman law or the Ten Commandments of Moses, the law does not make someone good. The law is like a mirror. It'll show us what the problem is, but it can't fix the problem. And that's why the first century letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to the Romans became so very helpful.
Jim, in the background we hear the Muslim call to prayer. And that would be true for every religion. All religions tend to moralize. They tend to go to laws and to what they believe God expects of us. But in reality, Paul's letter to the Romans makes it clear, no, it's not laws. It's something else that God Himself has done for us. It caught my attention that the Muslim call to prayer came at the very moment that we were discussing that obedience to the law can never make us right with God. Today, Jerash is a Muslim city, a city where most of its residents seek to follow a legal system that calls them to pray at least 5 specific times during the day. To be accepted by Allah, by their God, They feel that they must outwardly comply with the laws set down by Muhammad, whom they consider to be God's prophet.
Behind us is the Temple of Diana, a Roman goddess. During the times of the Greeks, this goddess was known as Artemis.
The Romans were polytheists. They worshipped many gods, which means that in addition to Caesar, they worshipped gods and goddesses, many of whom acted out lustful ways in relationships. So when you think about it, the gods and goddesses that the Romans worshipped were in many ways no better than themselves.
And yet they tried to gain favor with their gods. They would offer incense and sacrifices for blessing and somehow to become better. And yet they had no assurance that a God, their God, would bless them or make them any better.
It was in this kind of a world filled with temples to gods and goddesses. Into the empire came a letter written by the Apostle Paul to the Romans. A letter that addressed the problem, the human dilemma that all of us face even to this very moment. How do we resolve the gap between the kind of people we know we want to be and the kind of self-serving people that all too often we end up knowing we are? That's where Paul gives us an answer. It's come down, every generation has read this letter. It's called good news, at least Paul calls it good news, that instead of having to try to work to gain the favor of the gods and goddesses, the one true God, Paul says, has come down to us in the body of a man to do for us what we can never do. In fact, he did it all. This is what Paul's letter is all about. It's the opposite of human merit. It's the opposite of trying to appease the gods. It's letting God himself give us the gift that his Son bought for us.
God demonstrates his own love toward us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Romans chapter 5.
I remember sitting in the arena, watching the gladiators reenactment, remembering that sometimes there were Christians who were led to fight the animals and the gladiators. But even more importantly, I remembered, I started to imagine that all of a sudden in the middle of the fight, the Caesar, the governor, stood up and he got everybody's attention, and suddenly it was as if everybody stopped. I'm thinking in my mind. And then the governor steps out and he goes down to the arena and he motions to one of the poor struggling gladiators, one of the poor struggling Christians, and he motions him aside. And then he begins to fight. And then as I watch, it's almost as if voluntarily he dies. He dies in the place of this poor struggling fighter. You know, in real life terms, that's what Paul's good news and letter is all about. Only it's much more amazing than that. It's much truer than that. It's about the Creator God who becomes a man. That man voluntarily dies in behalf not only of one poor struggling fighter, but on behalf of every man or woman who's ever lived and sinned in this world. And Paul goes on to say, this champion, this king, this Messiah, this Lord, this sovereign, not only delivers from death this poor struggling person, but offers to give him or her everything they need. Paul's answer becomes life for anybody who will bow the knee to the one true God, who's offered to do it all. And all he requires is the faith in the heart, the surrender of those who will believe in him.